Hey, welcome back to Shaboom, this crazy podcast all about baby boomers and my generation. I'm now referring to myself differently. I'm referring to myself as Rick K. Jones. You're like, well, why would you do that? Well, I'm actually building a website on some of the content that I produce, and if you Google Rick Jones, good luck finding me. When you have a name like Jones, it's kind of hard. So I've determined that the best way to find me is Rick K. Jones. So I'll be saying that a little bit more. But anyway, I'm still your pirate captain and still your weekly host for this podcast. If you're wondering about what the K stands for, it actually is my mother's maiden name, which is my middle name, which is Kennedy. I just want to also remind you about our soundtrack each week. If you have time, one of the fun ways to watch the podcast is to watch it and then stop it when we refer to a song and play the entire song. I think you would enjoy it a little bit more about that. Today, we're going to talk about big events. We had so many big events in my life, and so many of them significantly impacted all of us. So, let's start with some big events from the past. The first song on the podcast today on the soundtrack of the podcast is the theme from the movie Rocky. Rocky is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's one of my favorite characters of all time. If you remember Rocky, it was set during the bicentennial. And the heavyweight champion of the world was a guy named Apollo Creed. And he decided he was going to give a gift to the American public by taking a nobody and giving him a shot at the title. Well, it almost cost him because Rocky Balboa put up quite a fight. If you remember the story, it was a young, struggling actor named Sylvester Stallone, and he had written Rocky. And everybody loved the script but wanted somebody else to play Rocky. And he refused to let that happen. He held out and said, no, this is my story. It's my screenplay. I'm going to play Rocky Balboa. And they finally allowed that to happen. And what did it do? Won Best Picture of the Year. So a really interesting thing. And then all the sequels to Rocky were really fun. And I think the last Rocky movie was one of my favorite, Rocky Balboa, where he kind of finished the unfinished business, as I like to say, whereas a older man, a man even, of this baby boomer generation, who went back in the ring against a young heavyweight champion. And while he didn't win, he put up a great fight. There were so many other movies when we were coming along that became big events. The Godfather came out in 1972. It was a Mario Puzo novel. Somehow or another, the studio gave the reins to a young director that very few people had heard of, named Francis Ford Coppola, and he created a masterpiece with Marlon Brando and Jimmy Caan and Al Pacino and others. And then the sequel in 1974 also won Best Picture, The Godfather 2. But probably the biggest movie of my life was in the summer of 1975. It's hard to imagine, but they used to play movies that weren't going to be hits in the summertime because they felt like no one would go to the movies in the summertime. That you'd be outside, you'd be doing other things. And so the big movies were always released around the holiday time, around Christmas, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. But in the summer of 1975, there was a movie coming out, and they kind of weren't sure how good it was going to be. But they gave a huge push for it with a tagline, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. And that movie was Jaws. And again, a young filmmaker named Steven Spielberg produced an absolute classic that then led to all of the other summer blockbusters. And in 1977, it was a blockbuster called Star Wars, which created so many spinoffs and so many other things. Lots of movies. But the first big event I can remember in my life as a child was a thing called Sputnik. The Russians sent up a satellite ahead of us. And the fear was that this satellite could shoot us. They could shoot bombs down on top of us, which was, of course, crazy, but at that time, no one knew. And so Sputnik became such a turning point in American history because it accelerated our development of our own space program. Then in 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in elementary school. The Russians were putting nuclear bombs, nuclear missiles on Cuba. If you know anything about Cuba, it's 90 miles from Key West. It's very close to the United States. And of course, Kennedy was the president. There was a standstill, and we were all concerned. And ultimately, the Russians turned back. They did not build the missiles in Cuba. They went back to the Soviet Union, but it was a very frightening time. But do y'all remember as kids what we did? We had nuclear drills, and this was the nuclear drill. The siren would go off, and we would get under our desk. Like, looking back, like I was going to really prevent a nuclear attack. You know, we were going to be fine under our desk. I think really was you were supposed to lean forward in your desk and kiss the rear end in front of you, because if it was a real bomb, we'd be kissing our asses goodbye. Nuclear drills, can you believe it? Well, I think a lot of baby boomers will relate to that. But then the next event that really touched us was the assassination of John Kennedy. November 22nd, 1963, I was in the fourth grade, Miss Mullen's class, and I remember watching all the teachers in the school in tears. Everyone was stunned by what happened. Don McLean wrote a very famous song called American Pie about the day the music died in 1959 when Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens were all killed in a plane crash in Iowa. But for me, the day the innocents died was the day of John Kennedy's assassination. The Kennedy administration had been considered Camelot. Camelot was a play on Broadway that was running at the time of the Kennedy administration, and there was a lot of illustrations and a lot of connectivity of that play to John Kennedy's administration. We absolutely lost our innocence, and we really never got it back. And after that, all hell broke loose in the 60s in every way possible. A lot of good came out of it, but a lot of bad happened on the way to progress. We were in the middle of Vietnam. We accelerated Vietnam under Lyndon Johnson. We had war protests everywhere. In 1968, which we've talked about being such a terrible year, we had one of the worst parts of the war in Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, where American troops killed a lot of innocent women and children in a village in Vietnam. We also then led to the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. We had riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago that year, and that all led to Richard Nixon being elected president. But the worst part that happened in the war came during Richard Nixon's administration. On May 4th, 1970, there was a protest at Kent State University, and the president sent the National Guard. They got trigger happy, and 4 college students were killed. Crosby, Stills, and Young recorded a song called "4 Dead in Ohio." It went, 10 soldiers and Nixon coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I heard the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. At the same time, there was some joy during that period, and probably the most joyful part was when we actually landed on the moon. We landed on the moon on Sunday night, July 20th, 1969. Another song on our playlist today is a song from the Embers, a beach music band, did a cover of a great song called Faraway Places. And that became kind of the theme of the space program. Faraway Places was something that was played. If you saw the movie The Right Stuff, where Sam Shepard played Chuck Yeager, and a great cast of those that played Mercury astronauts, Faraway Places was part of that soundtrack. But then came Watergate after Vietnam. And, you know, who knew that the president of the United States would just cheat, lie, steal? It just was kind of unfathomable for all of us. Merle Haggard recorded a great song during that era. The song is called "Are There Good Times Really Over for Good?" And one of the lyrics in the song says, "Remember when Nixon lied to us all on TV?" So we had a president that actually resigned rather than being impeached. And then Gerald Ford, who was not even elected. He was not elected as the vice president. Spiro Agnew had been Nixon's vice president. You remember he had done something illegal. He resigned as vice president. Nixon selected Gerald Ford, a congressman from Michigan, who became the vice president. And when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became the president of the United States. After that came Jimmy Carter. In the summer of 1976, though, we had another joy. We celebrated our bicentennial. And it was an interesting time. Again, coming out of Vietnam, coming out of Watergate, president not elected, very contentious presidential election going on, yet Americans rallied in a big, big way. We've got another big event coming now in 2026. It's our 250th birthday. Baby boomers will remember the bicentennial. So many of you young people won't. But this is America's 250th birthday, and it's going to be a big, big deal. And we'll have more information about that later in some of our other podcasts. Jimmy Carter was a Naval Academy graduate who planned to have a career in nuclear submarines, and his father suddenly died, and he had to leave the Navy and come home to run the family peanut farm. But he got involved in politics, and he became governor of the state of Georgia, and then one day decided he would run for president. I remember he told his mother, "I'm going to run for president." And her comment was, "President of what?" And nobody believed that Jimmy Carter could become the president. But again, he had the qualities post-Watergate where we really wanted someone we could trust. And he was elected very narrowly against Gerald Ford and became the president. But after that, well, let me say this about Jimmy Carter. There's a wonderful documentary. I have a good friend, Dave Kirkpatrick, who produced a documentary on CNN a few years ago called Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President. And it's really a great documentary about how many rock stars helped Jimmy get elected. Jimmy Buffett, Willie Nelson, Allman Brothers, so many people. In fact, Greg Allman had testified against some of his bandmates in a drug case and was kind of ostracized by the industry. Well, the first night Jimmy Carter was in the White House, Greg Allman was a guest and spent the night in the White House. And people asked him, "How do you do this?" And he said, "Because Greg Allman's my friend." And I invited him to stay in the White House. And Carter had lots of concerts and music acts that played during his 4 years in administration, so it was pretty good. But then along came 1980 and Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was a breath of fresh air for the American people. Jimmy Carter was probably a better, former president than the current president. He had so many issues, inflation and gas wars and hostages, that were taken in Iran and just a lot of problems. And it had a kind of a pessimistic message that we needed to sacrifice and that we were the problem. We needed to do some things. And Ronald Reagan came in and said, no, we're not the problem. Government's the problem. The American people aren't the problem. We just got too big a government trying to do too many things in our lives, and routed Jimmy Carter in that election. When he was reelected in 1984, Reagan had been shot. There was an assassination attempt. We talked about that when we talked about the Final Four of 1981. And a lot of people wondered if he was too old or if he was unfit to be the president of the United States. And he had a first debate against Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale had been the vice president of the United States under Jimmy Carter, was a senator from Minnesota. And he was running as the Democratic nominee. And the first debate, we knew they were going to make a big deal about Reagan's age. And they asked Reagan the first question, and he stopped and said, "Before I answer the question, I want to make it clear that I promise not to use my opponent's youth and relative inexperience in any way against him in this campaign." And even Mondale broke out in hilarious laughter. And Ronald Reagan went on to win 49 of the 50 states. The only state Walter Mondale carried was Minnesota. The week before the election ended, Um, some of Reagan's aides said, let's go to Minnesota. We can win there too. And Reagan, being so gracious, said, no, 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 no. Let's give the man his state. There was a famous ad man in California named Hal Riney. Hal Riney and Associates. This was an era that there were a lot of very, very creative ad agencies out of California. He had the Gallo account. He did some spectacular ads for Gallo wines that were, just exquisite shots of, the grapes ripening in the fields and the water and the picking the grapes and all this kind of stuff that was really, really interesting. But they took their bad wine and they created wine coolers with the bad wine. That was an era of wine coolers. And one of the wine coolers was a brand called Bartles and Janes. And Hal Riney handled that. And it was two farmers sitting on a porch named Bartles and Janes who created wine coolers, and it was really good. Well, the Reagan people saw Hal Riney's work and asked him to do the campaign in 84. And again, remember where we were in 84. We had the Olympics in 84, this high where we won all these gold medals. There was great joy in America. Unemployment was down. Jobs were up. The stock market was humming. A lot of positive things. And the ad campaign that Riney created for Ronald Reagan was called It's Morning Again in America. And it was an amazing ad that really celebrated everything good about America. And I remember that, and that led to the rout, as we talked about, of him winning 49 of the 50 states. On February 18th, 1983, something happened. We had the final episode of a television show called MASH, and it drew the largest television audience ever. More people tuned in to the final episode of MASH than any other television show in the history of television. Well, that didn't happen today. You got all these cable, you just don't aggregate an audience like that, but it was really kind of a big deal. We also had huge sporting events in my lifetime. I'm wearing today this very familiar logo. Well, this logo didn't exist when I was a kid. Converse All-Stars was the big shoe company in basketball. And Adidas, and we'll talk to my guest later today about Adidas, Adidas. They were the worldwide leader in shoes. But a guy named Phil Knight came along. He ran track at University of Oregon in Eugene. His track coach was a guy named Bill Bowerman. They formed a business, and they began to making shoes with waffle irons. Waffle irons, you know what waffle irons are. If you go to Hampton Inn, make your own waffles. They were making shoes out of waffle irons to have the kind of tread that they wanted. And then Phil Knight went to China, went other places, and figured out a way to mass produce these types of things. But Nike didn't exist, but it was fun to watch Nike in our lifetime as baby boomers become the dominant brand. And so Phil Knight, a baby boomer, built this incredible business known as Nike. And if you remember some of the great commercials, one of them was, there was a great athlete, college athlete at Auburn named Bo Jackson. And Bo Jackson was a great running back, but he was also a great baseball player. And he elected to play baseball and football. He played for the Oakland Raiders and the Kansas City Royals. And so they did an ad campaign called Bo Knows. Bo knows weights, Bo knows cross training, Bo knows this. There was a funny scene where it said Bo knows hockey, and Gretzky said no. But it was really good. And at the end of the commercial, somebody said, Bo Diddley, a very famous singer, said, Bo, you don't know Diddley. Well, the second commercial came out, and Bo's playing the guitar. And the tagline was from Bo Diddley, Bo knows Diddley, don't he? I mean, it was really, really good. But the greatest commercials for Nike were the Michael Jordan commercials. Spike Lee produced them. He had the character from his movie Mars Blackman, and it was, the great commercials, wonderful commercials using Michael Jordan. If you've seen the movie Air, you know the story that Nike bet the ranch. When everybody was signing lots of players, Sonny Vaccaro said to Phil Knight, no, I want to sign one player. I want to sign Michael Jordan. Now, people forget this. Michael Jordan was the third pick in the draft. The third. He wasn't the number one pick in the draft. Olajuwon went 1, Sam Bowie went 2, Michael went to Chicago as the third pick. But Michael Jordan turned out to be Michael Jordan, and it changed everything. I also watched, obviously, we've talked about the Final Four in previous episodes, the growth of the Final Four and how that had. I became a college basketball fan because I read a weekly reader. How many of you baby boomers out there remember the weekly readers? We got those in our school. It's kind of like a newsletter that was the first newsletter that went across the country. It was USA Today for kids before USA Today, the weekly reader. And I can remember being a young child reading the weekly reader, and it was about 2 basketball players at the University of North Carolina, Rusty Clark and Larry Miller. We lost Larry Miller a few weeks back. He was my first hero. He was a great college basketball player. He was the player that put Dean Smith on the map, and I remember that. The NFL grew in our generation. The NFL had been around for a long, long time, but it wasn't the NFL until 1959. In 1959, we had a championship game between the New York Giants and the Baltimore Colts. That game went overtime, and that game spurred the NFL on to the NFL, and then they formed the Super Bowl. Now, it wasn't called the Super Bowl the first year. It was called the NFL AFL Championship game. It was played in the Coliseum in Los Angeles, empty seats. 2 networks broadcast it, the AFL network, NBC, the NFL network, CBS. It wasn't even called the Super Bowl. But there was a kid's product out called the Super Ball that you could bounce. And Lamar Hunt had young children. One of his children now owns the Kansas City Chiefs. He owned the Kansas City Chiefs. His young children were playing with the Super Ball. And he said, why don't we call this game the Super Bowl? And it stuck. And really what made the Super Bowl was the third Super Bowl when a quarterback from the University of Alabama playing for the New York Jets met the heavily favored Baltimore Colts in the Super Bowl in Miami and guaranteed the Jets would win and would win easily. And they did. And the rest is history. The Olympic Games were a big deal in my childhood. And I was a boxing fan. I loved Olympic boxing. And in 1960, Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay, won the gold medal, not in the heavyweight division, but in the light heavyweight division. And then in 64 in Tokyo, Joe Frazier won the gold medal. And then in 68 in Mexico City, George Foreman won the gold medal. So you see what happened. You had these Olympic champions that went on to be heavyweight champions of the world, and it was a very exciting time. I remember George Foreman winning his bout and winning the gold medal and putting an American flag around him and running around the ring celebrating America. Conversely, you had 2 track stars, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who finished first and third in the 200, who protested with the black power and the gloves on the podium stand when the national anthem was going to be played. Then came 72 in Munich, and, we had joy and tragedy. The joy was you had a guy named Mark Spitz win, I think, 7 gold medals in swimming, but you had 2 tragedies. You had the tragedy of the American basketball team losing for the first time when they replayed the game 2 times over the last play and the Soviets won. Interesting, that American team has never accepted their silver medals. They've never picked them up. They believe they won the gold. But the big tragedy, obviously, was the Israeli athletes who were murdered by the Palestinians. And I can remember Jim McKay, the great Jim McKay on ABC, who came on air and said, they're all gone. They were all dead. And so that was the tragedy of that. In 76 in Montreal, we did regain the gold medal. Dean Smith took a bunch of college kids, and we won the gold medal in Montreal. He had an assistant coach named John Thompson that we talked about, and they later met in the national championship game, mentor and mentee in 1982. In 1980, we had an amazing Winter Olympic Games in Lake Placid, New York. And for those that remember, that was the classic Miracle on Ice We had a bunch of college hockey players that beat the great Soviet Union professional hockey team in the semifinals and then went on to win the gold medal. And then the 84 games in Los Angeles were a huge financial and critical success. The World Cup in 94, the Atlanta games that we've talked about in 96, and now we're preparing for another World Cup in 2026. My guest today knows a lot about big events and is a legend in big event sponsorships. You've heard in the past that the coach at Oklahoma was called Big Game Bob, and Bob Stoops was called Big Game Bob. I call Rob Prazmark Big Event Rob. And the song I want to play on our playlist today to introduce him is the great John Fogerty song, Center Field. The tagline goes, "Put me in, coach, I'm ready to play." Well, that's the theme of Rob Prazmark's career. And he's a fellow baby boomer. He's the author of a terrific book, The Olympics Don't Take American Express, The Birth of Mega Sports Sponsorship. Let's welcome Rob to the show. Rob, welcome to Shaboom.
Love it.
I'm so happy you're with us today. You know, we're talking about big events, and you've been such a part of so many big events, big sporting events, like the biggest of the biggest sporting events. Let's kind of go back and start from the beginning. Born in Northern New York, spent time in California. You came back to New York to go to college. You went back. What made you go to Canisius?
It was not my choice. I was born in Buffalo. Then my parents moved to California back in the rocket boom. And then that was a great experience. Then they moved to Washington, D.C., and then all of a sudden they moved to Buffalo. And I thought I had gotten into the UVA. And because, great, but when Dad decided to move to Buffalo, in-state tuition gone. Okay, so he goes, "Hey, good news, you know, I got you into my alma mater, Canisius." And I go, "What's Canisius?" And so I went 4 years, and I hated it. Hey, I mean, the Buffalo, it just snowed every day. The factories were shutting down. It was a true definition of the Rust Belt. The thing that we would live for is going to Buffalo Bill games and watching O.J. Simpson run. You know, I mean, that was the big deal. So I got out of there pretty quick after graduation day and got down and got into the media business after that. But
well, you know, you mentioned O.J. Simpson. You know, we all remember post NFL with everything that happened, but people have forgotten what an unbelievable football player he was.
Absolutely. I mean, he, it's unfortunate his, personal life went a certain way, but he was absolutely terrific. And I feel bad that the NFL, I think for PR reasons, diminished his accomplishments. And if you notice, they really don't promote him at all in any of the greatest runners or anything like that. But he was absolutely terrific, and he was entertaining to watch. You know, so we would go to the Bills games, and we would sit with calculators. Remember the whole big handheld calculators? And we would add up his yardage, because you didn't have what you have today in terms of,
instant stats and all that stuff. Right.
So,
yeah.
So, they're tearing down the old stadium, the Ralph, or Coffee Rich Park was with the original name of it. And Rich Products, which made creamer for your coffee, they paid an amazing $3 million for naming rights. And there was such an uproar of that they were going to name it Coffee Rich Park that they agreed to just name it Rich Stadium. So that was my first kind of introduction to sports and naming rights and stuff like that. Of course, there was Wrigley Field and, others before that, but Coffee Ridge Park, it was great. So
that's crazy. I didn't know that. Rich Stadium is because of Coffee Rich. Wow. How about that? Who knew? Now we know. Now, America, So it's a great story. So you went in the media business. Did you know you wanted to be in the media business?
Oh, big time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I grew up much like we all did with Jim McKay and Roone Arledge and Jim Lampley. I wanted to be Jim Lampley. I wanted to be the guy that went into the stands and found that, a gorgeous cheerleader. Okay. I wanted to be that guy. But in those days, there were only three networks, and we didn't have Fox back then. And so I went on a quest to, get, and I sent letters out to everybody, and eventually caught up with Roone Arledge. But there was nothing for a kid coming out of Buffalo. I knew no one, and Canisius, God love him, didn't have a big alumni base. It's not like Notre Dame. I mean, you go to Notre Dame, you got a big, or Penn, you got a big alumni base that all help one another. Canisius, we didn't have anybody. So I went out and sold airtime. I got a job at WDCA. I don't know if they exist anymore, under those call letters. But they had the Washington Capitals, and they had the Washington Bullets, that they were called back then. And I sold airtime, for them. And I loved it. I loved it. I loved going out to the local carpet dealers and car dealers and putting them on the air and, all that kind of stuff. I just got a big kick out of it. And then I got a call from NBC, and I moved up to New York and started selling spot sales, which is a spot sales is a term where you represent a number of different local affiliates. And, loved that job. And we had the 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. And that didn't go well. So if you recall, U.S. boycotted those games, but I caught the fever. I caught the Olympic fever. And then I went over to ABC Network News. Loved that job, selling, Barbara Walters and 2020 and
That was Hugh Downs, wasn't it? Hugh Downs that had 2020
yeah,
during that? Yeah.
Hugh Downs and Geraldo Rivera, and these were studs. And so, but I got myself in a lot of trouble because I didn't care about management. And management,
That's so like our generation. That's so like a cowboy like you. It's like, oh, I forgot about the sheriff.
yeah. And so what I would do is, when we were selling Academy Award specials for Miss Walters, you couldn't call her Barbara, Miss Walters, I would, put together these huge deals, and I just call her up and say, hey, listen, I can put this package together, but I need for you to make one or two board of director speeches, to put this. And remember, she owned her own production company called Ballwall Production. And she goes, do it. Well, my management didn't think that was funny. I mean, not at all. And but then I started doing other deals, and it caught Roone Arledge's attention. And our generation knows who Roone Arledge is. And so he showed up in my office one day, and of course it caught the entire floor by surprise, because here was head of sports and news eventually, and he wanted to shake my hand. And so my immediate management didn't think that was funny. I mean, not at all. So I'd come up with these ideas like ABC News business briefs, my idea, and never heard of that before. And I just hated it. So I knew my days were limited at ABC. Okay. Because if you're a troublemaker, and I was young, I was 30, 31. So then a guy by the name of John Lazarus, father of Mark and Peter, I think there's one other son in the business too. And then he ran ABC Sports. He was a god. Whatever he wanted to do, Roone said do it, because he was the revenue machine. And they have the rights to the Olympic Games in 1984, and they needed, people. I was in news, but they were trying to get me into sports. And John wanted me to come and be one of his hosts. So you take advertising clients and you show them around. And man, I caught the Olympic fever. I met this or saw this guy, Peter Uberoth, and I said, "This guy's a god. Oh my God." And I think he was like 44 at the time when he gave the opening and closing remarks. And
Hadn't he been in the travel business? Wasn't he like in the travel business, like in an era when you used travel agents? I think he had a.
he owned Ask Mr. Foster. Okay, if you remember that. He was in the travel business, and they, LA was basically bankrupt, and the whole IOC was bankrupt, but no one knew that. And Peter did a great. I got to know him years later. That's another story in the book, and he created demand and for the LA games, and with nothing more than his personality, he went out there and got Coca-Cola for a whopping $12 million, and the deal was signed between him and Don Keogh, then chairman of Coca-Cola, on a paper napkin. I saw the paper.
Let me tell you a great Don Keogh story. When I got out of intercollegiate athletics, I got hired away from Georgia Tech to go work at Conan Wolf
Yeah.
for a guy named Bob Cohn, and we had the Coke business from a PR standpoint. Did pin trading, did Hands Across America, did the ridiculous launch of New Coke that turned out to be not so ridiculous because it re-energized the carbonated, sugar water category. But here's a great story. Cohn goes to Keogh and he goes, "Don, I think you ought to hire Conan Wolf to go around the world and find out just how much the Olympic movement means to the Coca-Cola company."
Mm-hmm.
And Don says, "Bob, why would I do that? I like the Olympics."
Yeah.
I just love that. It's like, I don't want any data. I like the Olympics.
Yeah. He was a guy that you could sell to. He's now moved on in his life, obviously, but because it was an emotional fit for him. If he liked it, he bought it. Okay. And that doesn't exist today. I mean, you've got so much analytics going on, and you got shareholder responsibility. You got partners in corporations and stuff like that. So Don was a great guy, but if he didn't want it, he didn't want it. I mean, forget about it.
Yeah, he was a Notre Dame graduate. You mentioned Notre Dame earlier, but he was, in that era at Coke, he was a why not guy versus a why guy.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you could sell big things. I want to come back to your career, but I want to take a little detour here. We're talking about the games in '84. That was a seminal moment. I mean, it made the Olympics at a time, like you said, Montreal was bankrupt in '76. We boycott Moscow in '80. IOC's broke. Perfect storm. Uberoff does an amazing job, but we also had great American personality athletes in '84 that won medals and became darlings of the media. The whole way ABC told stories, the up close and personal. I mean, it was a great thing. We got another games coming here in '28 in LA. I think they're in trouble financially. We had such bad games in Asia. Bad ratings, bad politics, bad things, that it kind of, in my opinion, it stalled the Olympics. It almost put a roadblock up or speed bumps. And a lot of American companies have kind of said, I don't know. Paris did a good job, in my opinion. I'd love to hear your opinion on how well Paris did. But I think LA, they don't have many sponsors.
No, and when I look at their roster, I think they're missing some, unless I, missed something on the internet. They're missing some huge categories. I mean, they don't have banking and telecom, and they now have, I think, automotive. But they're missing big categories. And not that they've gotten lazy or complacent, but I don't see the fire in the belly. And they've got 3 years to go. I mean, three plus a few months. And, having repped the Olympics for so many years, the clock is ticking when you get into your cycle. And I thought they were going to come out of Paris with more announcements than they did. And they're drafting off of the IOC money that comes out of the top program. Um, and I think one of the anchors, to be candid, is a good thing, bad thing, is they've married up with NBC, so you just can't buy the rights to Los Angeles. You've got to also commit 200 million to NBC. And I'm a little bit to blame for that. Way back in the day, because I came up with that idea. But the commitment a corporation has to make is now maybe reportedly 400 million, 200 going to LA and 200 million going to NBC. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea. It just takes the decision-making process to a total different level. Now, way back in the day, my good friend John, your good friend John Costello at Home Depot, when he ran the Empire, I'll never forget pitching Home Depot for one of the games. And he goes, well, how much is television going to cost me? I go, I don't know. How much is hospitality going to cost me? I don't know. He goes, well, just come back with one number. And because I'm going to go to the board with one number, I can't say, well, we don't know this, know this. And that kind of created my thinking in terms of packaging. But you can overestimate or overpackage some of this stuff. But I think modern day thinking today, you're more involved in it than I am, in terms of packaging, NCAA rights with broadcast rights, all that kind of stuff comes together, and it's the right thing to do. But you can overprice your product.
Yeah, and again, they're looking for that one number because the numbers have gotten so big they have to get board approval.
Yeah, exactly.
The days of Keogh going 12 million, I'm in, no problem. Not now. Not now. $400 million, you're going to go to the board. Conversely, we have a World Cup coming in 26, and they seem to be doing really well financially, and have attracted a number of American companies, Home Depot, Verizon, others, that Bank of America, that you would think would be Olympic sponsors, but have gone the other direction.
I'm not going to name the company because I'll get myself in trouble. But they are a company that sponsors both World Cup and Olympics. And they told me, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that they don't need the Olympics. They need World Cup, because World Cup is a passionate sport. And we're going to, you and I are old enough to remember the 94, which was seminal in its day. Alan Rothenberg, Randy Bernstein, what they did with creating MLS. It's been a slow grind, but the Club World Cup, which is this year, maybe a little bit early to come here because normal Americans don't get it yet. There's a big difference between rooting for an MLS team, okay, than rooting for Man City or Barcelona. I mean, that's passion. And so the Club World Cup is going to be great, but I'm not quite sure I'm diverting, sorry. Americans are ready for Club World Cup. They will be ready for the World Cup. When President Trump, is promoting it, he's got the frickin' trophy, on his desk, okay? I mean, he he, he's really behind it, and I get it, I get it. And the World Cup, not the Club World, the World Cup, I think it's going to be huge, and I think the price of entry also, Rick, for World Cup is not as for domestic sponsor is not as big as an Olympic thing. I did hear Fox Fox is out with their packages and mucho dinero, but I don't think there's a it's an option to buy. It's not mandated in the contract, is what I've heard. I could be wrong, but that's what I've heard.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. You and I have traveled a lot. Here's an interesting stat. Only 3% of GDP for the United States comes from international travel, versus Italy that I think is like 62%.
Right.
What a window we have. We have our 250th birthday, we have the World Cup, and we have an Olympic Games in basically a 36-month period to attract tourism to America. And I'm hoping that the Trump administration will understand how to connect those dots in a way that may make us attractive, because we just don't get the same amount of international tourists as other countries do.
That's this is probably an old stat, but I heard it years ago that only like 10% of Americans have a passport. Okay, I mean it's some stupid number. So we're kind of a isolated country because we don't travel. Okay, I mean you and I did because of our jobs, but they don't travel. Where the European, South American, Asian communities, they love travel. They love travel, and I think that I mean there's some emerging international sport that's slowly coming here. I mean, dare I say cricket, okay, is strange sport to Americans, but it's got a following. I mean, huge following.
Yeah, they had, I guess, a test, whatever, in New York that just sold out. Obviously, you've got a lot of Pakistanians and Indians, and they did all that. When did you get? There was an agency called ISL that a lot of people have forgotten about. International Sports and Leisure, was that the acronym?
Yeah, we called it International Sleaze and Lust, but
now, when you got there, was Horst Dassler still alive?
He was.
And he was the visionary.
Oh, he definitely was. And he was the guy, as the story goes, he was the guy who went to the IOC or put up the money to say, listen, I'll give you $5 million for the global rights to this thing called the TOP program.
Yeah, and for our listeners, Horst Dassler ran a little small athletic apparel and shoe company called Adidas, which was a monster. Adidas. Yeah, and it was, Adidas. Here we call it Adidas. And they were brothers. I think one brother went off and created Puma, right? And the other brother, and they competed literally, I think, across the river.
They did.
Yeah.
Horst, God, he died at 57. I mean,
cancer. Yeah.
Cancer.
Yeah.
And, but him and Samaranch were bosom buddies. And so, put up 5 million. And then that was just for the rights it was only a 9-month experiment, this worldwide thing. And that was the fire in the belly that I had. I mean, I had 9 months to produce. No one told me that. 9 months to produce that the global program selling the Olympics on a worldwide basis would work. Now, nowadays you go, how stupid's that? But back then you had 2 global brands. You had Coke and Kodak, and maybe Adidas. And that was it. So when I would ring up, people like FedEx or anybody else, they'd go, we're only doing business in 5 other countries. So why do I want worldwide rights? But we did it, and that's one of the stories in the book. I promote the book.
Yeah, I think it's really the seminal story. I mean, the story that I had heard was you had one that said, "We'll come in if you can prove it with somebody else." That maybe Coke was like ready to fall, but you had to prove somebody other than those, and you thought you were going to get a deal done with American Express, and really felt like that was going to happen. The CEO of American Express later said it was the single biggest business mistake he ever made in his career because he let Visa in the tent.
Yeah, that you're right. Coke and Kodak were kind of a done deal by the time I got there. Um, Kodak. Now we kind of go, "What's a Kodak?" But Kodak was the brand. Um, and so the IOC gave Dassler and International Sleaze and Lust, ISL, a 9-month window to prove the program could work. And you had people that did not want to participate. You had the United States Olympic Committee did not want to participate. Seoul in '88 did not want to participate. Calgary was no way, but the IOC forced them. And so it all fell on we needed one more big deal. And because Coke and Kodak, everybody expected. And we put our heart and soul into American Express, and they were, I don't know, almost a Google of yesterday. They were so. I mean, I'm not calling Google arrogant, but they were so arrogant because they were clearly the number one brand. Visa was probably 3.
No question.
And you had MasterCard, MasterCharge back in the day. So when we bet the ranch and IOC members were involved, and they go, basically, I say this with respect to your audience, go pound salt, okay? We had like 3 months to go. And so it was a cold call, to a woman named Jan Soderstrom. And she
Who worked for John Bennett.
yes.
And Bennett got it too.
Bennett got it instantaneous. So we had this big presentation at then BBDO, and Jan said something great. She goes, "Listen, I worked at Atari, remember Atari, and they were a sponsor of LA, and I understand LA 84. I understand the Olympic movement. So don't just come with me with a nice video. Come with me with ideas." So we came in with 3 ideas. One was putting the marks. Actually, I have it here. The marks on a card. Okay, and I still have this card today. Okay, because we felt that
Which hadn't been done before.
never.
Right.
It was the first
Right.
affinity card, if you
Right.
think about it. Because I thought, hey, if I'm going into a restaurant, I'll pull out my Olympic card because maybe someone thinks I'm an Olympian, something, all that kind of stuff. Number 2 is cause-related marketing. American Express pioneered that. And I said, well, every time you use the Visa card, we'll make a donation to the local team, meaning the U.S. or Puerto Rico or Mexico or Venezuela. We'll do that. And we'll make you the preferred card at the games. Meaning when you go to Calgary or Seoul, we prefer you to use the card to buy the merchandise and the tickets. John Bennett was smart enough to say, "Son," because I was young in those days, "Son, what? We have a new campaign rolling out, and it's
everywhere you want to be.
And if you go to a little restaurant, make sure you bring your Visa card because they don't take American Express." He says, "If you deliver me the Olympics, we'll do the deal." I said, $15.5 million, worldwide rights, including traveler's checks. Remember those? and we'll do the deal. And so I had John sign a letter that I gave to the IOC. I said, we got to deliver this, and we've got our savior. And Dick Pound, and I think you know that name, went to Samaranch, and who was president of the IOC at the time, and said, and Samaranch says, well, American Express turned us down. Master Charge turned us down. Diners Club threw me out of the building when I asked him for $15 million. He goes, let's do it. So we did it. And that really changed, I think, the not only marketing world, but the Olympic marketing world and the great platforms we have today.
Well, we've got so much we could talk about. I want to bring you back because I want to do another episode on rivals, and I really want to start with what became an interesting rivalry. Hold up your book again. The Olympics Don't Take American Express. It created a war, and the rivalry between two brands, American Express and Visa, but also the rivalry between Jerry Welsh and American Express and John Bennett. And so I'm going to have you back. We're going to make this a two-parter. I'm going to bring you back. And I want to pick off where we left off. I want, first of all, everybody out there, hold up a book. You got to get this book. This book is phenomenal. And I mean this. It is a trip down memory lane, but it really talks about so many innovative things that you were involved in that everybody goes, well, we do that now. Well, we didn't then. No, the Dallas Cowboys didn't have sponsors outside of the NFL. The World Cup didn't take paint barter in order to get other sponsors in, some of the crazy stuff you did there. So I want to come back in the second part and do that. And so we'll schedule that here for the next couple of weeks from now, and come back and do part two, because you got too much wisdom and too many stories.
I'm working. It's just a cover, but my part two is called Innovators, Imitators, and Idiots. And
there's a whole big section on the idiots, I have to believe.
The problem is I'm starting to run out. The part one ended in 2010, so this will pick up after 2010, and you got to be careful now about lawsuits, right? The
people we can talk about idiots before then, most of them are dead, so it's okay. We can do that, but we're still here. So listen, I'm gonna bring you back.
Okay.
I can't thank you enough for being my guest today. We'll bring you back here soon and do part two. Thanks for being part of Shaboom today.
Good friend. Thanks. Brett.
It's now time for the boom. I keep telling you that college sports is broken. I really believe it's broken. I believe NIL is non-sustainable. But recently we saw something interesting happen. President Trump showed up unannounced at the graduation at the University of Alabama, had a private meeting with Nick Saban, and the next day he named Nick Saban to be co-chair of a committee to look into everything about college sports. Here's what I know about Nick Saban. He knows what he's doing. I kind of put my money on Nick Saban. I think he can bring sanity back to college sports. I'm counting on it, and that's the boom for today. It's now time for the song of the week. One of the big events that happened in my lifetime was this music festival in Woodstock, New York. A bunch of kids went to Yasgur's farm, and they thought maybe, 20,000 would show up. Well, about 500,000 showed up. They had all these great rock bands. It's the first of many, many large music festivals that we know about today, but it was the first of its kind. And there was a young Canadian songwriter named Joni Mitchell who played there, and she went home and wrote a song called Woodstock. And while she did a recording of that song, the most famous version of that song was written or performed by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And that is the song of the day, a song of the week on our playlist. It's time to get back on the road with Rick. We're talking about big events. We're talking about bucket event, that you need to do. You need to go to a Super Bowl. You need to go to a Masters. You need to go to an Olympic Games. You need to go to the Kentucky Derby. The Kentucky Derby is a one-of-a-kind big event. I've been fortunate to go 3 times. I've had a marvelous time each time I've gone. I have a couple of good friends, Sam Dunn and Malcolm Jennings, who owned their own agency called Bluegrass Marketing for a while. And one of their clients was Regions Bank, and they would bring Regions Bank private banking customers to the Derby every year. And one of the cool things they would do was they would ask the wife or the date or the significant other to send them a picture of her dress that she was going to wear to the Derby. They would take the picture of her dress, and they went to the leading hat maker in Louisville who made all these hats for stars, and she would make them a hat to match their dress. And the night before the Derby, on Friday night, they would have a private dinner at a restaurant, and there would be a hat box on the seat of each lady, and they would, one at a time, open their hat box and put on their hat that they were going to wear to the Derby for the next day. If you go to the Derby, if you go to Louisville, you got to go to the Brown Hotel. The Brown Hotel was a place where people came and danced, and they danced very, very late. And the chef one night realized, they don't want to just eat bacon and eggs. I got to create something special. And so that night he created a dish called the Hot Brown. The Hot Brown is smoked turkey on toast with Mornay sauce, cheese, and roasted tomato under the broiler. It's an amazing dish, the Hot Brown, created at the Brown Hotel. It's what you need to eat on the road with Rick when you go to Louisville, Kentucky. On the playlist today, we honor the Derby with a song by Sawyer Brown called The Race Is On. Let's now have a glass of wine and do a little whining. The wine and wine. We have a new pope. He's American. I think when he was speaking Italian, when he had his introduction, somewhere in there as a Villanova graduate, an Augustine school, he said, beat Georgetown, which is a Jesuit school, which is the big rival to Villanova. Turned out he wasn't a Cubs fan. The Cubs said he was a Cubs fan. He's a Chicago Whites fan. But interestingly about this Pope is he really is a man of 3 places. He's a man of America, a man of South America because of the time he spent in Peru, and a man of Italy for the time he spent in Italy in the town now that he's living and working as the Pope in Italy. Guess what? There's a winery called Banfi Wines, family owned since 1919. And where do they grow grapes and make wine? 3 places. Italy, America, out on Long Island, and Chile in South America. Banfi Wines. You can toast the Pope with a 2020 Castello Banfi Brunello Maltacino. Great wine. Toast the Pope. Now, what are you going to whine about, Rick, about the Pope? Here's my whine. I just realized for the first time in my life, the Pope is younger than me. Ouch. That one hurts. It's time for the last word. The great editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, Helen Gurley Brown, once said, never fail to know that if you were doing all the talking, you were boring somebody. Well, I do all the talking on the podcast, and I hope I'm not boring you, because while I do have lots of faults, I don't believe being boring is one of them. We close with a song on our playlist. It's Toby Keith and Jimmy Buffett with A Piece of Work, because I kind of think I'm a piece of work. We'll see you right back here next week on Shaboom.